Thank you all so much for joining us. I'm Loretta Farrell. I'm the director of the Human Rights Institute at Kean University, and I'm very excited about tonight's program. This program tonight is co-sponsored by the Human Rights Institute, Kean Athletics, Women's and Gender Studies at Kean University, and the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. The impetus for this event, however, came from my friend and colleague, Adam Hutchinson. So I am going to introduce him now and ask him to introduce our really exciting guest speaker. So Adam is currently the Assistant Director of Athletics for Internal Operations. It's a position to which he was named in October of 2020. In this capacity, he coordinates and develops comprehensive development programs to support the academic success of over 400 student athletes at Kean. In addition, he has oversight of diversity and inclusion initiatives for the entire department. He is the Athletics Diversity and Inclusion Designee, known as ADID, where he is responsible for the oversight of all diversity and inclusion initiatives. He is the point of communication between the NCAA National Office, Kean's Athletic Department, the Conference Office, and our entire campus with information about inclusive programs, emerging diversity issues, and other related equity initiatives. Prior to this, Mr. Hutchinson was the head men's basketball coach at Kean, where he collected his 200th career victory. He came to us in 2018 after stops at Amherst College, Washington and Lee University, Case Western Reserve, and Stevens Institute of Technology. A 1993 graduate of Amherst, Mr. Hutchinson played basketball for 4 seasons before earning a Bachelor of Arts degree in Black Studies. He went on to earn his Master of Science in Sports Management from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst after receiving the prestigious NCAA Graduate Scholarship for Careers in Athletics. Born and raised in the good old Garden State, he starred and graduated from the renowned St. Benedict's Preparatory School in Newark. So I am very happy to turn this over to my friend, Adam.
Thank you, Loretta, very much. And thanks for everyone for attending. I started thinking about this idea of inviting Toni-Smith Thompson to speak to students in 2017 while sitting on a panel discussing the role athletics play in advancing social justice. As fellow panelists opined alternately that Kaepernick would be fine because he was a millionaire, or that his protest was motivated by a desire for future millions, I was struck by how little consideration they were giving to Kaepernick's stated reasons for his protest, how little regard they had for the price he was paying, and to what extent his narrative had been hijacked by conservative talking points. The whole experience reminded me of articles I'd read about Tony's protest some years prior. Something that I don't think as many people were currently aware of. My enthusiasm for asking Toni to speak has only grown in the years since. Young people have long played an energizing role in advancing progressive American causes through protest, and the ongoing struggle for Black Lives to Matter is no different. As a former student protester myself 30 years ago, on the same issue, I might add, I'm acutely aware of the what next feeling after winning hard-fought but sometimes small advances. Wanting our young people to know they're supported, their bravery is valued, their sacrifice is recognized, wanting them to know that free speech isn't free, and wanting them to begin thinking about sustained engagement led me full circle to consider how we all might benefit from hearing about Toni's experiences and wisdom, particularly how Toni transitioned from her role as a protester to working with the New York Civil Liberties Union, which she joined in 2011. I'd like to thank Kean's Human Rights Institute, the Women and Gender Studies program, and the Office of Diversity and Inclusion for partnering with the Kean Athletic Department to bring this to fruition. And with that in mind, Toni, welcome to Kean University.
Thank you. It's so nice to be here. Good evening, everyone. I know that you've been asked to keep your cameras off, but I am scrolling through and looking at all of the photos and names that I can see. And so I'm really happy to be here and participate in this discussion.
So Toni, can you tell us a little about the climate of the country at the time of your protest?
Sure. I started protest. Well, I never know how far back or like where to start from. But I attended Manhattanville College, which is a small liberal arts college in Westchester, New York. And so I was there from 1999 through 2003. And my protest took place during the 2002-2003 school year basketball season. And so I think, I don't know the age range of folks who are on this evening, but this year is the 20th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks in New York City. And so my protest was in the winter of 2002. So it was really still in the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks. And so that was the current climate of the country in which my protest started. It was the attacks on September 11th, 2001. Immediately after that, there were already kind of signs that we were headed down a path to like vengeance and retaliation. There were already immediately there was a big push to use sports as a way to bring people together and heal from that moment. Through displays of patriotism, by incorporating new practices into sports, like emphasizing the playing of the national anthem and playing God Bless America. All of those things began to happen pretty quickly after September 11th. And so sports really became this vehicle for healing and unity, right? But then very quickly that also turned into a very toxic nationalism, where rather than kind of people voluntarily engaging in healing and unity with each other, there was a pressure to conform and be obedient and participate in these forced acts of patriotism. And so, that period in the country, I mean, you could argue for all periods in our country's history, right? But during that period in particular that I'll focus on, the atmosphere of dissent was nothing like it is today. I don't want to say it was virtually non-existent, because you will always see pockets of resistance if you look for it. But the expectation and the kind of the dominant discussion in our country, the dominant discourse was to conform and to not dissent, right? To not do anything that would be seen as resisting unity, right? Or like not being in support of the retaliation for the 9/11 attacks. And so that was the backdrop for my protest.
I remember that well, and I remembered exactly how you described it. So given that that climate, what reactions did you experience to the stand you took, and how did you navigate those reactions internally?
It was really interesting. So I'm born and raised in New York City. So I didn't stray far from home to go to college. Westchester, Manhattanville is like 35, 40 minutes away from New York City. And I was on a team that had players who were Black, players who were white, players with other backgrounds. My mom is white, my dad is Black. And so for me, I guess I'll talk a little bit about my own kind of evolution to that year and then the response to it. I was a sociology major. And so, in my time at school, I kind of got there as a freshman, recruited to play basketball. And I come from a family of activists. And so it wasn't like activism wasn't new for me. But I think out of all the people in my immediate family, I was sort of the baby activist, because I was really into sports as like my dominant way of expression. And so, over those 3 years heading into senior year, it was getting into my sociology courses. It was starting to learn about how systems work in this country and kind of functions of power, and beginning to have like language and understanding of what I had experienced and what others had experienced, right? Like, I think all of us to some degree, we have experiences in our life and we know things are not quite right. You know, there are people who are hungry, you know that there's housing instability, but you don't necessarily have the language or learning to piece together why that is, right? And to kind of like direct where you're going to find that information. And so I think like my time in college was very much about on discovering that for myself through that coursework. Like, oh, this is how the prison industrial complex works. Here's how the nonprofit industrial complex works, right? Like, here's how women and people of color are depicted in media, just like all of the different wheels in motion. And so I think by senior year, I was finally kind of like at a place where I was finding my voice and expression. And so I think the original question was about the response to the protest, but so when I decided to protest, it was really quiet. And so I think Kean is also a Division III institution, right? So Manhattanville is also a Division III athletic institution. And so, you know, for any of you who attend sporting events or play sports at the school, Division III athletic events are not generally the events that are like the talk of the city, right? Like, stands are not always packed. I know for us, it was sometimes hard to get your roommate to come to the game. You know what I mean? So like, it wasn't, if you were to choose a place to protest in order to draw the most attention, for me, it would not have been on the basketball court where I played. Right. But, you know, so it was a really quiet protest. It really just came out of a conversation that I had one day about coursework and learning, and like, wait a minute, why do we have to stand and participate in the national anthem in order to play basketball? And in growing up in New York City, the schools that I attended, we didn't say the Pledge of Allegiance. We didn't stand for the national anthem during, before basketball games, we didn't do the national anthem and the flag. I mean, like, courts that we played on could be so spotty that like the last thing that people were worried about was whether and where there was a flag placement. It was like, is there a backboard? Does it work? Is there a net? Are there chairs? You know what I mean? Much more basic elements of the game, right? And so, so when I got to Manhattanville, a lot of these norms were new to me. The expectation to stand for the national anthem was new to me. On my team, one of our coaches during those 4 years had us pray before games. That was very new to me. That was not part of my personal practices. So there were all of these different practices that were just expectations that were part of being on a sports team that didn't quite fit for me. And so by senior year, the playing of the national anthem against the backdrop of the post 9/11 period, where the standing for the national anthem was no longer voluntary, and it was no longer actually a display for those for whom it was before, right? It was really transformed into what we like to call it, a symbol of freedom or unity or whatever it means for you. But it was really weaponized in a much more visible way. And I know on my team, the national anthem was something that was routine, but you know, people might be talking to each other during the national anthem. You might be poking the person in front of you or behind you. Like, it was just a thing that was happening. And it got turned into something much more toxic in that post 9/11 period, right? Where there was much more attention on what you did during that period to demonstrate that you were a good citizen, that you were a good patriot. And that was partly what my protest was resisting. And so that was like a very long way to not even answer the question. So, but the response to the protest was really non-existent at first. I protested for quite a number of games. And so December and into January, before anyone said anything to me about the protest. And just for clarification for people who don't know, during the playing of the national anthem, I would turn the other way rather than face the flag and like with hand over heart or whatever you do. So I decided to face the other way, and I decided to do that because I thought it would be I thought it would draw less attention and be less offensive than like sitting on the bench or, I mean, I wouldn't have thought to kneel, but all of these other kind of variations of what I could have done, I thought turning the other way would still allow me to be standing with my team, which was important to me, but also like participating, you know, with my team. And so nobody said anything to me for quite a number of games. And it really wasn't until I guess there were some parents of teammates on my team that were upset about it and went to the school president to complain. But I think what really had my story go from kind of a school confined protest to a national and international story was that we played a school whose, when I remember this correctly, whose assistant coach had been deployed overseas. And so they had a very strong response to my protest, and I exchanged words, where one of the other players exchanged words with me. But that team then called ahead to the next team that we were scheduled to play to give them a heads up about my protest. And the next team that we were scheduled to play was the Merchant Marine Academy. And so that really, I mean, when that story got covered about how the Merchant Marine Academy prepared for our arrival for that game with, you know, what seemed like hundreds of flags filling the stands, the sidelines of the court, you know, cadet students in uniform kind of lined along the sidelines, screaming at us the entire game, cursing at us, telling us, you know, all of the usual things, go home, you don't belong here, and many worse things. So I think that's really what propelled it into a national and international news story. And so there was, you know, the backlash was severe, and the protest was debated on sports news shows and in media, newspapers. This was before social media. And
New York sports news shows?
Huh?
New York sports news shows got it?
All the news shows
Okay.
got it. I mean, it was, I mean, Sports Center, right? ESPN, someone, I think a friend of mine at the time, sorry, sidebar story. A friend of mine at the time was traveling abroad. And so she had been to Italy and had come home, and someone sent her a package from Italy. And when she opened the package, it was wrapped in a newspaper, and I was in the newspaper from this Italian newspaper.
Gotcha.
So that's just like an example of the reach.
Okay. And so I'm struck because I'm familiar with the New York sports coverage, and once they get a hold of something, they don't let it go. So how did you navigate that internally?
It was rough. You know, I was trying to graduate. It was like, you know, you're bumping into, so all of this really blew up in the final semester of my senior year. So I think I probably had finished the core of my coursework. I had finished my thesis, I think, but, you know, but I was trying to graduate and trying to finish the season. And the school, I was completely unprepared. The school was completely unprepared for the type of response that was in response to my protest. And so people were able to get a hold of my direct phone number into my dorm, and the school had to like disable that. Mail was being sent to me to my college address by the like bushel, you know. So rather than have the mail go into the mailbox, campus staff had to just collect the mail in these enormous bags and go through it before giving it to me to make sure that there was nothing dangerous in the mail. So we were completely unprepared for the response, in addition to mail and news and newspaper. So mail, news, newspaper. I mean, there were radio shows, there were TV show offers, the usual, I mean, the same circuit that exists now, where there's like some news story and then it becomes big, and then a few days later you see them on kind of like the TV circuit, and then it goes away. And so that it felt pretty similar to that, except it didn't quite go away, right? It did stay. The story had some longevity, but ultimately it did fade. And at the time, I didn't do, for the most part, I didn't do any of the TV or radio, any of the media stuff. It just wasn't, that wasn't why I was protesting, and it didn't feel like I didn't feel like I had the language and ability to navigate mass media in a way that I thought my words or my protest would be represented in a way that would feel right. I think about that a lot today because we have social media. And so everyday people, all of us, have this direct access to speak directly to the public. And that just wasn't available in 2002 and 2003. You know, everything was done through press statements or through press conferences or giving a quote to a newspaper. And all of that was really subject to how the story would be positioned within a larger context. And so I kind of just shied away from it all and just kept it as a pretty quiet protest.
It's pretty wise of you to recognize the danger
Wow.
of your narrative being hijacked.
Yeah, I mean, that's one way to see it. I mean, I think it was the choice that I made at the time, and I think it was a fine choice. I think in the many years since, and watching how athletes have demonstrated activism now, and young people generally, how you've demonstrated activism now, there is so much opportunity to speak in the moment about what you're doing and why you're protesting. And there's an opportunity for people to join in, right? Or for people to take your protest and interpret it in their own way and carry it on. And it wasn't even a consideration of mine at the time that somebody could join in, right? It didn't even occur to me to say to a teammate, do this with me. Here's why, you know, even though I would say like, here's why I'm protesting, it didn't occur to me to say this could be a movement, similar to what we've seen in more recent years.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
You talked about developing a framework to understand the moment in your sociology classes, and you kind of talked about developing a language, a framework of language to say what you wanted to say. Let's talk a little bit about the framework of where you were competing. What was the culture of your sport at the time? How did that impact what you experienced? How was college basketball different than high school in those ways?
I feel like that's a multi-part question. I think, let me think about how to answer this. So yeah, there was a huge shift from high school to college. I think largely the way I think about it is at the time, so in the previous question, I just talked about how it didn't even occur to me to ask other people to join in.
Mm-hmm.
And I think for me, when thinking about the backdrop and context of that time, I realized that a lot of the relationships that I had developed on my team over those 3-4 years, you know, college sports, like your team, that's where you're spending most of your time. That's, you know, 6-7 days a week. You are with your team. You're on the road with your team. And so or I'll speak for me, but the automatic feeling is, this is my family, right? Like we are a family. And that is really pushed on us in our culture, that sports is a family, right? Like even if you're a fan, like if I'm a Yankee fan, the Yankees are my family, right? Like I feel this personal connection to the Yankees. Like I have a personal stake in this team. And I think that is very much the messaging that I experienced as an athlete as well. It's like, you're part of the team. This is your identity. You got to be unified. Everything you do has to be for the team. And when I started protesting, very quickly, I realized most of my team was not coming with me, right? And actually, many of them were actively trying to make sure that I couldn't go with them, you know, from starting petitions to have my academic scholarship revoked, demanding that I be kicked out of school, parents of teammates who had welcomed me into their homes for dinner, suddenly showing up to basketball games, waving flags and not talking to me, or otherwise like campaigning on campus with other parents. And so I think that the context for me was, I really distinguished that it's really easy to spend a lot of time with people and build relationships without asking the right questions about, what do you value? Who are you, right? What do you know about me? Are we trying to go to the same place here? And is there anything connecting us beyond this sports team? And it feels, what I love about now when I look at young people, student athletes, professional sports, it feels like there has been a shift. It feels like that is different now. It feels like it is less common now for people who are sharing so much time together on sports teams to not talk about politics, right? To not say like, hey, what do you think about what's happening right now? And I realized that on my team, we didn't really have those conversations. It was very superficial. And it wasn't until senior year that I really saw that. It was painful.
So this observation might confirm what you just said, or it might run counter to it. But one of the things we've seen since Kaepernick knelt is college coaches forcing conformity during the anthem. This has taken the form of requiring everyone to stand at attention. I believe a gentleman at Virginia Tech did that, or having athletes link arms, essentially making it impossible for anyone to kneel. Most recently in the news was Bluefield College in Virginia, where the president ordered players to either stand for the anthem or remain in the locker room. And players were suspended for ignoring this directive. You know, what are your thoughts on this, that phenomenon?
Yeah. You know, I think that, like I was saying before about kind of this idea of team identity and unity, I think when that is the reasoning given for why you need to conform or participate in certain practices on a team, we need to ask, who is this unity for and what is it in service of? Is it in service of the institution so that the institution can maintain money and resources, right? Or garner more resources? Is this unity exclusionary of people on our team or people in our community who are not feeling included or represented or valued right now? And so I think this, you know, when I protested that year, I was co-captain of the team. And so there was a conflict for me when people were like, you're a leader on this team, like what you do reflects us. You need to be unified with the team because you are a representative of the team. And particularly for student athletes, I think that's a faulty premise to apply to sports anyway, but also for student athletes, you're not just an athlete, you're a student. You are playing sports because you're at an institution to learn, right? And to question your reality and to kind of like figure out your own path. And so when I think about contemporary, like current examples that I've seen from sports teams, what I love is I'll use the WNBA as a great example, who've obviously been rock stars in especially the last recent years, but even before then, it really defined for me what it can look like to be unified as a team. And so rather than having a coach say, you all need to stand and be unified in accordance with what the institution says is right for the institution, the players actually take it upon themselves to say, no, we're going to create what unity looks like for people and for community. And we will stand together in that, in service of that, in service of all of us, not in service of an institution, right? But in service of people.
Yes, I'm sitting here smiling, saying amen. So it strikes me that your questioning, the depth of your questioning, epitomizes what it means to be a good citizen, not just accept things at face value, but to ask who and what and why and when. Moving into the present, how is your past as a protester informed your current career?
Oh, it informed it so much. I think that my experience as a protester was the first strongest personal experience I had in distinguishing the difference between having rights and having access. And for me, a lot of the conversation around my protest was centered on whether I should have the right to protest during the playing of the national anthem. So obviously there's a huge part of this protest that is about freedom of speech and expression. Absolutely, right? We should be able to express ourselves. We should be able to, we have protest rights in this country. Like that is what the First Amendment is. the freedom to practice your religion, to speak, to express yourself, to protest. And so wait, I forgot where I was going with this. What was your question again? Let me get back on track.
How it informs your current career.
Yes.
And could you please articulate what your current career is?
Yes, that's probably important. So I'm currently the senior organizer at the New York Civil Liberties Union. And so I work on, I work as an organizer, and so that can mean organizing people, mobilizing people to take action, to pass policies, to work on shifting culture and understanding around issues. Most of the issues I work on are related to policing, so reducing the footprint and the role of policing, reducing kind of the punitive nature of educational practices, so like reducing the use of suspensions and arrests in schools, reducing the reliance on high stakes testing as a way to shape our educational curricula that students experience. And so different, I work on various campaigns and issues related to social justice and civil liberties, also like including some privacy and tech stuff. So including like your right to digital privacy, and right, like your right to not have the government spy on you and surveil you. So that's my current profession. And so, saying during my protest, kind of understanding, having this entire conversation around free speech, there were many perspectives, right? But I'll just focus on two. There were a lot of people who said the flag is what gives you the right to speak, therefore you should respect it and not protest it. And then there was another camp that said the flag gives you the right to speak, therefore you should speak and protest it as much as you can, because otherwise what are we fighting for? And that, that ran the span of people in various kind of backgrounds and professions. And so there were people who had military service, who were in both camps. There were a lot of current and former military members that were like, listen, this is what we fought for. If nobody's going to express themselves and actually use the First Amendment, then what are we even doing? And so, it was really interesting to me that there is this argument that you can have rights, but because you have those rights, you should never use it. And I was like, well, what good is a right if it's up in a glass box somewhere where nobody can access it? And so, as I started my career, I went into the nonprofit sector. I worked in an organization that did direct service work with young people, and then moved on and came to work at the New York Civil Liberties Union, which does less direct service and more advocacy to change laws and policies. And so kind of taking a broader systemic look at the needs of people and how to meet those needs and address those needs through changing laws and policies and practices. And so I think the lesson that I learned during the protest, which was what good is a right if you can't use it, I've applied to the work that I do now. And so that has to, we say the same thing with regard to life and liberty, right? Being free from incarceration and unjust kind of policing practices and discriminatory educational practices and government spying, right? Like especially post 9/11, we've seen this massive shift into more militarized police forces. And like New York City is really kind of ground zero for all of that with the NYPD kind of really establishing itself as a domestic counterterrorism force, and acquiring lots of technology and other equipment to better surveil and to better track people and to better limit our freedoms. And I would say kind of like early in my time starting to work on issues of privacy as it relates to government technology and even private technology is a common thing that I would hear people say is, well, I don't have anything to hide, so it doesn't bother me. The government can spy on me, because if you have nothing to hide, what's the problem? And it is a problem, right? Because it's your right to have privacy, and having privacy and having rights is not just about what you think you are hiding or not hiding. It's about you having the right to be free from that intrusion, right? And you having the right to not have your personal information used in ways that you don't consent to, that you haven't authorized, and that you have a right to not have used in those ways. And so, you know, I think similar to my protest during 2002, 2003, this idea of relinquishing your rights or forfeiting your rights for some out of fear is something that we see a lot of now. There's just like this prevailing sense of forfeiting our rights in the name of security, in the name of national security, in the name of local security, and kind of operating from that place of fear does a real disservice to the rights that we say we hold so dear. If that makes sense.
It does. So I don't know if you've thought about this one, but it occurred to me as you were speaking about the acquisition of technology and surveillance. I read an article recently that discussed how police departments wanted officers to have cameras for surveillance purposes, and how they may not really be intended to protect citizens because officers can just turn them off. Did you have any thoughts on that?
You know, I mean, in the work that I do, like we are the NYCLU, New York Civil Liberties Union, we've done work on body cameras. Other organizations have done work on body cameras. I think as they were first emerging as a potential reform measure, there is certainly a potential utility in having more eyes on the police, and actually a growing amount of the work, especially in the last year in my department at work, has been on people being on the ground and monitoring the police. So there's definitely a value in doing that and having people actually like working to hold the police accountable that way. But when the police are the ones that are in control of the technology and are in control of the laws and the policies that dictate the use of the technology and the maintenance of that technology and who has access to it and for how long, then the utility really largely goes away when the institution who is supposed to be being held accountable is in total control of that technology.
Thank you for that. I got one last question before we open it up.
Yep.
You spoke about being exposed to these perspectives to your protests, different people from different walks of life sharing their opinion with you. What did allyship look like back then? And what would you think allyship would look like now?
Oh, such a good question. I've thought about allyship so much as a grown-up now, reflecting on my experiences as a student. And some of the work that I do now, we have a youth activism project. And so I've gotten opportunities to work with our young people on activism projects, on public speaking, on other types of like issues that they want to tackle. Like, what are the tactics and strategies we can use in order to accomplish what you want to accomplish? And that has me think a lot about how allyship, both at a peer-to-peer, both from peer-to-peer, but also allyship by adults supporting young people. And so I think two pieces. One is this might not be the total view, but how I've seen this evolve over time, especially in the context of sports, is that the standard or expectation for allyship has evolved or shifted. And so, you know, when I protested in 2002, 2003, there were two teammates of mine who supported me, like really supported me, right? Like they were basically my only friends on the team for most of that year. They were the ones I hung out with. They were the ones on road trips, like it was us three. And so they made that choice to sort of to shift their own social circle so that they could support me. They didn't join in my protest. They would hold my hand during protest. And then that seemed bold. It almost seemed radical, right? And I certainly appreciated it and needed that support from them. But if you look at today, when you look at athletes kneeling and otherwise protesting during the national anthem, what does it look like when a player who is standing is standing next to a player who's kneeling, and the player who's standing like has their hand on the kneeling player's shoulder. Doesn't quite spell out allyship in today's protest environment, right? Like solidarity looks like you kneel with me. And
That's right.
that is the expectation, or that's the standard for how we define solidarity now. It's not enough to just stand next to or put a hand on. And so, I think how allyship has been viewed has evolved over time, at least in my experience. And then also on campus, it seemed really progressive at that time that the president of my college didn't want to expel me, right? Like that was seen as radical. It's like, you don't want to expel her? Wow, like it was like so out of the norm. I mean, there were people calling the college, yelling at him, telling him you should be punishing her in X, Y, and Z way. But he was supportive of my right to protest, which at the time felt really important. And it was really, and it was necessary, right, for me to kind of continue my protest. But what I've realized in the years since, as I kind of reflect on the experience and as society shifts and evolves, between my coach who backed me up, who supported me, right, the president of the school who supported me, both by saying outwardly to the media, listen, we're an institution that kind of encourages critical thinking and social change in our students, and we support her right to express her views. What they didn't do was say, we agree with her, right? Not a single adult at that institution that I remember actually said publicly, in the context of this protest, she's talking about injustices. She's talking about the mistreatment of Black people, Black and brown people in this country. She's talking about the legacy of genocide and slavery and Jim Crow, right? And these are important topics that we should all be listening to. And I agree with her. And so like as an adult, that is something that I, at some point was like, I'm gonna do better than that. Like the young people who are organizing today are gonna not just have my support, they're not gonna just have my tolerant support, they're gonna have my full support. And I'm actively gonna be looking for or anticipating the roadblocks that they are going to come up against and the backlash that they're gonna face. And I'm gonna work to get in the way of those. I'm gonna work to be a roadblock, so to clear the path so that they don't have to deal with that as much as possible. And so I think thinking about allyship, there's a huge opportunity for adults who are supporting young people who want to find their activism voice and want to figure out how to challenge systems of power and to stand completely with young people and not just validate that they're young and they should have the right to do it, but that you actually agree with them because young people are brilliant.
That's an inspiring answer. Trying to get in the way of those roadblocks. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
With that, let's open it up to questions. So how do we want to navigate the Q&A session?
If anybody has a question we do have some questions in the chat, but I want to give people the opportunity to ask questions directly. So if you want to turn your video on and unmute yourself and ask a question, this would be the opportunity to do that. Okay. And maybe while we're waiting for folks to do that, we can, look at some of the questions in the chat.
I said I wasn't gonna be distracted by the chat, but I have been looking at the chat. So,
okay.
There are, I just saw one, like the first.
So
the first one is, what can athletes do to combat the shut up and dribble attack?
So the shut up and dribble attack, I mean, I think the important thing to hold with regard to those responses is the criticism against athletes speaking out against injustice is never about it's never actually about the protest, right? It's never actually about whether athletes in particular should speak or not speak. It's never about whether your profession relegates you to be quiet on the sidelines somewhere. It is always about power and control. And so if Colin Kaepernick had protested that first game, and everybody was like, oh my God, why is he sitting down on the bench? And afterward, if they had gone up to him and asked him why he had sat out the national anthem, if he had said something like, I just want to pay my respects to all of the people who've been lost serving overseas. If it was like a nod to police or military or any kind of power structure in this country that is idolized, people would have been like, oh, wow, that's amazing, that's deep. I mean, we wouldn't even be having this conversation. So
Right.
It actually is not about whether he protested or about whether I protested or any other person. It's about why, right? And Adam, you started by talking about the why of his protest. And there continues to be this effort to not talk about why he was protesting. It could be the national anthem. You could be protesting on the sidewalk. You could be blocking traffic. I mean, I'm not telling you to block traffic. I'm just saying, like, there are ways people are moved to be expressed and to have their voices heard. And if you are speaking out for injustice, about injustice, and you are speaking out against systems of injustice, systems of power, it is the reason that is going to draw the backlash. And so, I think the shut up and dribble is a kind of a false, you don't have to respond from that place. Whether you're an athlete or anyone else, you speak because you have something to say, right? You protest because you have an expression. And, if it's not the national anthem, people will find a different place to protest. And if an athlete there have been athletes that protest for a number of reasons, right? But it is specifically when you are speaking up for the most marginalized members of society. In my case, like speaking up for Black folks. In Colin Kaepernick's case, speaking up for Black folks, specifically people who are murdered at the hands of police. That is always going to draw backlash, no matter where you say it, no matter how you say it.
Yes. What is your favorite part about working at the NYCLU?
Mm-hmm. Oh God, favorite. This is a favorite, but it's not always easy. We work on so many issues that I find it, as someone who likes to make sense of how things work and likes to ask questions, it is really, really valuable to work at an organization that works on everything from voting rights to government surveillance, to policing, to education, to LGBTQIA rights, to gender, gender and sexuality includes that, to disability rights. Like, there's just, you can see how everything intersects. And it's really, I love being able to really dive into how systems, white supremacy, systems of power operate in this country, not in a silo, and not limited to targeting or harming one group of people, right? Like it is all intertwined. And I think it's really important to see that. I mean, I think there have been plenty of examples, especially in the last few weeks, this week alone. I mean, just incredible and horrific acts of violence that are all connected back to kind of systems of white supremacy, and really being able to remove individual, what am I trying to say? So understanding that everybody has a role in it, but that you have to combine individual action, but also broaden your understanding of kind of the systemic, the structural, the societal, and how they play together with what you as an individual can do is really important. And I would say, especially as a young person, thinking back to when I was a young person, but also now working with young people, it's really important to give people, okay, so what can I do about it?
So during this pandemic, we've seen an uptick in protests for various causes. However, some might believe this is only possible due to the pandemic, and that after the pandemic is over, the hype for these protests will die out. the awareness we've seen these past few months will go away. Do you believe this to be the case? Why or why not?
The pandemic has certainly created pathways that wouldn't have otherwise been traveled. I mean, opportunity is one way to say it. The pandemic has created opportunity for protest. It's kind of, sometimes there's a tension between calling it an opportunity because we're still in the middle of a really horrific pandemic. But I think generally speaking, protest movements happen in waves. There's a period of time where there's a convergence of events that kind of like gives birth to the next wave that pushes society in a direction. And then they do die down because there's a period of push and there's a period of like, now sit in that new reality, and then you push again. And so, yes, I think there will be periods that protests die down, but we may be in a period where we're going to see protests resurface in a large way more frequently. I mean, I think we're now almost a year into sustained protest movement in the wake of killings of Black people at the hands of police. And in that year, there are places in this country where protests have not stopped. And so I think that's really important to hold, that even where, especially in the age of social media, right? Like we just have so much access to information, there is a protest somewhere every moment. And so I think protests will shift, absolutely, but I don't think they will go away. What I think is important to note is, especially as we talk about activism in the context of sports, and as we talk about the last 4.5 years since Colin Kaepernick protested, in today's moment, where you have enormous amounts of wealth and money driving the sports industry, you have enormous amounts of wealth you have enormous contracts that athletes are getting, particularly, I mean, we're talking about mostly male athletes here, but you have continuing growing of wealth inequality in the country. So the type of concentration of wealth and then starvation of wealth in other areas does kind of elevate for me that it is very easy for protest movements to be co-opted by corporations and other institutions that can control the narrative. And so, I was speaking on a panel in 2018 for the 50th anniversary of the 1968 Olympic protests, centering on Toni-Smith and John Carlos, but there were obviously other athletes there as well. And in 2018, we were about 2 years out from Colin Kaepernick's first starting to protest. And I think the first Nike ad that he did had just come out, if I'm remembering correctly. And what I noticed most was that this first Nike ad with him did not include any image of him protesting. It actually included an image of him standing and speaking with an American flag behind him. And the message was something like, stand for something, even if it means sacrificing everything. Did I get that right? And I remember thinking, wow, that wasn't about protest at all. That was going back to your earlier point about unity. The goal here was inspiration and unity, right? Like stand for something, even if it means sacrificing anything. That could mean anything. I mean, I could be standing for cupcakes. You could be standing for dictatorship and fascism. Like stand for something is not very specific to the injustices that we are specifically talking about. And so I think while I don't think protest is going to stop, and there are going to be waves, and there are going to be periods of higher profile or more highly visible protests and then lower visibility protests. What I think is the challenge for activists and people on the ground is co-opting of protest movements is happening more quickly, it seems, and corporations that are getting into the business of social justice because it feels good and it looks good and it's profitable. You got to stay ahead of that co-opting, right? If suddenly everybody's on board with your ad, then you probably need to redirect and go a different direction with the messaging, because if systems of power and people at the head of corporations are on board, who definitely don't want to dismantle the same institutions that protesters do, then there's a conflict there that we should just be aware of.
So a lot of this is about, what we're talking about is about using our voice. And so we have the capability, everyone, if you click on reactions, to raise your hand. And so rather than read questions from the chat, if everyone would please raise their hand, and I'll point that out, and we'll address that, and you can articulate your question directly to Toni. So Aaron Lester, I believe you had your hand up. Is that accurate?
Yes. Hi, Toni. Hi, Adam. Hi, Loretta. Hi, everybody else. Sorry, I'm in my car. I'm actually an athlete too, and I also coach. So I am coming from my practice right now, but I didn't want to miss
No worries
this
at
session.
all.
So my question for you is also, I wanted to introduce myself. I'm from the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, who also joined in on co-hosting this event. I'm the program coordinator for student affairs. My question for you is, you were talking about the different levels of protest, some that are very much visible and some that are non-visible. I know for me personally, I like to encourage people to protest day to day. And I was wondering if you had a day-to-day protest that you do on like a smaller level. I know for me, when I was in high school, at least, and when I was an athlete growing up, it was very important to me to capitalize the B in Black when I was writing any English paper. Not really sure why that was like such a thing for me, but it really was something that was super important. And it was just a very low level scale of protest to symbolize that it's very important in my identity. It's very important for other people to recognize that when they're engaging with me. So I was wondering if you had an example of something that maybe you do, or a smaller day-to-day protest that others could participate in to just keep the dialogue kind of going and to keep the current situation shifting.
Yeah. I love the I've also been in the capitalized, non-capitalized debates around the B, which is a whole nother thing. So yeah, no, I love this question, and I love the idea that protests could be small or big, because really the way we quantify small and big are so arbitrary and like situational. And so, my protest, not saluting the flag during the national anthem, is a small protest. And there, when I think about that time period before social media, there could have been other athletes across the country doing the same thing. I would have had no idea. We don't know. But because other stories don't get national or international news coverage, doesn't make them lesser, doesn't make them smaller. It doesn't make them less important for the individual. It still would have mattered to me to protest that season if nobody had noticed. I mean, obviously, like there's so much more to the conversation because it was noticed, but it still would have mattered to me, and it would have felt small, but it would have felt important to me. I think when I think about my day-to-day work, there could be like people who, my colleagues could be like on here also, but it's fine. I'll say, like, working at an institution that works towards social change, a big part of that work is speaking up or organizing internally in that institution, right? Like when we recognize that every one of our institutions, for the most part, have been kind of built up in a country that was not as attuned to harms and justice the way we are now, and hopefully we will continue to move in that direction, right? And like, so I think a big part of the way I protest on a day-to-day basis is by speaking up internally in the organization. And it could be, and it's like, it can feel hard, especially like thinking about a college class. There are ways to speak out about something or protest in a small way that's not necessarily seen as defiant, right? Or it doesn't feel like I am breaking some enormous rule here, although someone could choose to do that as well. But I think just small day-to-day protests are actually a really important way that institutions change within.
So
Is that a good answer?
Ashley Sanchez has her hand up as well. Ashley?
Hello. I
Hi.
apologize in advance. My connection is not the greatest. I'm actually part of Loretta's class, and we actually had a conversation our previous class about the roles of, well, celebrity athletes and celebrities in general when it comes to protesting. So I just wanted to know your opinion, because you had mentioned that even though your protest was small and no one was really looking at it in the beginning, it was still important to you. So what would you say about big celebrity athletes doing protests? Like, what's your opinion on that versus like them taking a step back and letting like people who are more personally attacked by certain things take the limelight?
So important. So the Atlanta Dream and the WNBA, what I love many things about how they've moved together and acted in these years that I've been paying attention. One of the things that I really loved about their approach is that they recognize that they have a reach, they have a visible reach, and that they're not experts on the ground. And so there was, a lot of the early reporting about their activism included mention that they were meeting with organizers on the ground to deeply understand the dynamics on the ground and to work in partnership to figure out the best role for them. And so I think with any celebrity, athlete, but any high profile person, especially for like nonprofit institutions who are always looking to you want your work to be more visible, to expand the reach. And it can be really exciting and tempting to just be like, what celebrity can we get, right? Can we get this person? That's going to be great. If we just get this person on board, then like this will make so much money or this will have so much reach. But I think being really thoughtful about those partnerships so that everyone is clear what their role in the dynamic is. I'm here because I have reach and I'm visible whether I want to be visible or not. That's a role that celebrity can play. And I'm not the expert on the ground. Who is the expert on the ground? And how do I make sure that I'm directing the visibility that I have toward the people who are actually doing the work, rather than absorbing the attention, co-opting the space, and probably changing the messaging in the process. So I think there are ways to do it thoughtfully, and we've seen examples of it being done really thoughtfully, where you're constantly uplifting the work that's happening on the ground and making sure that people, one, recognize that movements don't succeed overnight. So sometimes a celebrity will do something and then there will be a noticeable change a short time later, and the story will be so-and-so did this thing, so-and-so celebrity did this thing, and then this change happened. When actually it was like a decade of organizing on the ground that the celebrity attached onto or found out about and then got involved in, right, in a nominal way. So I think being thoughtful about those partnerships is important, but it can be done.
Thank you.
So we have time for one more question. Someone would like to raise their hand. Julia?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, yes. I wasn't gonna ask a question, but I've been really heavily bothered today. I just finished listening to the Judiciary Hearing Committee about the discrimination and hate against Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, especially because of what happened in Georgia. I'm getting emotional. And during the hearing committee today, it was planned way in advance. There's no way they could have known that, a person was targeting Asian businesses, driving miles to seek out these victims. And one of the opening speakers continued this rhetoric of our talk about trying to go against hate speech and discrimination. And so this person was trying to say that we're attacking their freedom of speech. And I just want to know what you think about when victims, people of color, try to point out things are wrong. How do you go against them for flipping the script on us? A lot of that victim blaming, that like, oh, we're just trying to defend our own freedom of speech. You can't tell us to police what we say, when the virus originated from China. And so I just wanted to know what you thought about that.
Yeah. Thank you for that. And thank you for being here tonight, despite the heaviness and despite the pain. It can sometimes feel like, is it going to be supportive to attend something or to connect with other people while dealing with something really hard and painful, especially, you know, when it's connected to community or community. So thank you for being here and for deciding to ask the question. Speech, I think about speech a lot. And my protest is a huge reason for it, obviously, but I think about it a lot in my work as well. And a couple of years ago, so what are years now? After Charlottesville, after the events in Charlottesville, maybe 3 years ago, was it 4 years ago, where a young woman was killed in the course of the protest by a white supremacist. There was a lot of conversation in my organization, but also among many other people and groups about the balance between freedom of expression and racial justice. And one of the things that I did in response to that in my own work was I created a workshop for young people and for educators to help my own thinking on the issue, right? But also to help sort of balance and make sense of the tension that often arises between free speech and equity. And there have been many kind of court cases and arguments in this country about the limits of free speech and whether speech is money and whether corporations have free speech and whether corporations are individuals or people, right? Like there's all this conversation about what are the limits of speech. And I think about speech through the lens of power. And so if you think about the First Amendment as giving you the ability to, the freedom to have a thought and then share that thought with someone else, an idea with someone else, and then share it with multiple people, and then have it be kind of amplified via the press, and then be able to organize people around this idea and be free from retaliation from your government for having those thoughts and sharing those thoughts. There's a large swath of this country that doesn't enjoy that whole range of what the First Amendment is supposed to offer. And so it is, I often argue that I'm not the only person, but I often argue in these cases that there's no neutrality. Speech is not just this objective kind of platform where everybody has equal access. And speech does not all get counted the same. It's not all valued the same. If Beyonce tweets something with however many followers Beyonce has, that is not equal in impact to my whatever 1,000 followers on Twitter if I tweet. And so there's a power imbalance there, and there's a reach imbalance there. And I think this conversation has really expanded or become more visible in the last 4 years during the last presidency, right? Like there were a lot of conversations about what should be the limits of the use of social media by someone who is president of the United States and the harm that can cause. And so when I work with young people, the conversation I have with them is, you may have the right to say what you want to say, but to what end? What is the goal here, right? Like your speech does have an impact. It can be used to build, it can be used to harm, it can be used to form relationships, it can be used to dismantle relationships, it can be used to share power, it can be used to hoard power. And while we kind of debate the legal limits of what you can legally say and not say under the First Amendment, for those of us who are committed to a more communal and just future where all of us are included and enjoy kind of like the full belonging to as people in this land, then you have to make different choices, right? Just because I have the right to doesn't mean I need to, doesn't mean I want to, because I don't want to cause harm. And so rather than talk about free speech, I talk about speech equity. And I talk about ways that we can work to remove barriers to speech that other people have, because it's not really it's not only that people say things that are hateful. People do, and always have, and probably always will. It's that in our country's history and our government systems and our dominant culture reinforce and amplify some speech and actively suppresses other speech. And really acknowledging that there's no neutrality in that, right? That for the most part, there is speech that is actively privileged, which tends to be speech that continues to marginalize people. That is what we're working to dismantle, recognizing that speech is unequal and that speech is given an amplification that other speech doesn't get and is actively suppressed. And so, yes, freedom of expression is important, but it doesn't exist in a vacuum. It exists within the workings of all of the other rights and benefits and access that we have, but it's all in pursuit of a more just society and future, I hope. I mean, that's my goal. And so that's how I think about the use of speech, and that's like how I advocate through the lens of speech.
Thank you, Toni, very much. Loretta?
So for those of you who know me, I get very emotional, and this was just such an incredible night. Toni, I can't even begin to thank you enough for sharing your story with our students and the greater community. And Adam, thank you for bringing Toni to us and for helping our students to think about what happens after protest. I want to thank Consuelo Bonillas, the Director of Women and Gender Studies program here at Kean, and Tamika Quick, the Executive Director of our Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, for their co-sponsorship of tonight's program. But what I really want to do is I want to thank our students. They make me so proud, and they remind me every day about why I am here. And I am hopeful that knowing that they are going to be the next generation of activists and allies and leaders gives me great hope for our future. But thank you to everybody who came tonight. I hope that you found something in here that you can take with you and that can help you build your own path from protest to participation, whether you are a college student or you're somebody like me who's coming to the end of their career but still has a lot of stuff that they can offer. It would ask you all to...
Can I say something? I'm sorry, wait, can I interrupt you?
Of course.
Should I wait till you're done? You're done? There was something you just said that I wanted to add on to. I'm sorry that I just made you lose your train of thought.
No, go ahead. Oh,
I wanted to make sure for people on here, because the title for this evening is From Protest to Participation. And just because so often, especially in these years of like elevated visible protest activity, protest is often pitted against civic engagement and activism. And you'll often see it among professional athletes or like celebrities when they got involved in athlete protest. It was like, we got to do something more than taking a knee, right? Like we can't just protest, we got to act. And it's like, no, protest is action. Protest is participation. It is actually one of the most powerful ways to participate in our society, especially now. So I just want to make sure that you leave with that, knowing that I think that, hoping that you kind of appreciate that as well. Like after 2003, if I decided that my role was to be a protester from here on out, and that was like my form of expression, then that would be a truly wonderful, bold, daring way to participate in society, and a really important one.
Thank you. Thank you. Wow. Okay. Keep your eyes open for what our next program is going to be. We've got a lot that we're still going to offer, and please know that we plan on being back in person on campus in the fall, and I am looking forward to welcoming you all back. And maybe Toni, we can have you come and kind of take a tour and get to meet some of our students.
I would love that.
Oh, we'd love to have you.
I would love that. I wish I could see, I mean, I've still been scrolling and looking at photos, but I do love seeing faces also. So just know that I'm reaching through and looking at your faces.
This is great. Well, everybody have a good night. I don't have to wish you safe travels because I'm going to assume that you're all probably where you're going to be for the rest of the night. But again, thank you so much for coming out, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.